Evening, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to the Courtauld from me. I'm Dr. Esther Chadwick, senior lecturer here in art history, and I'm truly delighted to be celebrating Dr. Stephanie O'Rourke and her new book, published by Chicago University Press, Picturing Landscape in the Age of Extraction, Europe and its Colonial Networks, 1780 to 1850. Thank you all so much for coming and for being with us this evening. This is going to be really interesting indeed. Thank you to Diego Arteche, Alice Rafter, and the Research Forum team for facilitating this evening. It's a huge honour to have Stephanie with us, to introduce herself, her book, and to also, though, welcome Professors Susan Siegfried and John Tresch to join her in discussing it. I just want to draw your attention to the little hand sheets going around which give you a discount on the book, so please do pick those up. There are some here, but there are some more downstairs on the table, and I encourage you to make use of the code and purchase a copy of this very handsome and important volume. Following John and Susan's responses and then discussion between them and Stephanie, we'll invite questions from you, our audience, and then we'll continue with drinks in the Research Forum seminar room, to which you are very, very warmly welcome, so we can continue our conversations there. First, though, I'm going to introduce briefly our speakers before handing over to them. So Stephanie O'Rourke is Senior Lecturer in Art History at the University of St Andrews. She's one of the most exciting scholars of European art in the Romantic period working today. She's published widely on topics of ever greater urgency, on art and infrastructure in 19th century Britain, deep time in the work of Caspar David Friedrich, electricity and art during the French Revolution, and race in 18th century French art. Her prize-winning first book, Art, Science and the Body in Early Romanticism, published with Cambridge University Press in 2021, looked at the changing status of the human body as a reliable source of sensory or scientific information. Artists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Stephanie argued, subverted and undermined empirical understandings of the body, contributing to, and at the same time illuminating, a crisis of Enlightenment thought. And we will see how her genius for working with the intersections of art and science is brought to bear on this, her second book, which we are celebrating tonight. A book that seeks, as she puts it, to place art histories in dialogue with environmental histories of European extraction. So we really can't wait to hear from you about the project, Stephanie. As I say, Stephanie will be joined by Susan L. Siegfried, who is Denise Riley Collegiate Professor Emerita of the History of Art and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She's a leading figure in the study of French painting in the decades around 1800. Her latest book, hot off the press in January this year, is The New Taste, Fashion and Art in the 1820s and 1830s. That's with Yale University Press. And related research includes Millet and Yellow, the Oxford Art Journal, a wonderful essay. The Allure of Dress in Ingres and Picasso, in Picasso Ingres Face to Face of 2022, and Fashion in the Life of Georges Sand with John Finkelberg in Fashion Theory. She also published Ingres, Painting Reimagined in 2009, Staging Empire with Todd Porterfield in 2006, and The Art of Louis-Léopold Boilly, Modern Life in Napoleonic France in 1995. And then finally, Professor John Tresch, Professor of the History of Art, Science and Folk Practice at the Warburg Institute. He writes on the intersections of technology, human and natural sciences, politics and arts. His books include The Romantic Machine, Utopian Science and Technology After Napoleon with Chicago in 2012, The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, such a wonderful title, 2021, and the forthcoming, excitingly, Cosmograms, how to do things with worlds with Chicago. So without further ado, I will invite Stephanie to first talk about her book, and then in turn Susan and John to respond to it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here on the most beautiful day. But hopefully you'll see like the final glimpses of the day dwindling as this proceeds. I'm enormously thankful to Esther for hosting this evening, and to John Tresch and Susan Siegfried for taking the time to read and respond to my book. The last time I was in this room, I think, was to discuss Esther's own tremendous book, The Radical Print, about a year ago, and her brilliant capacity to sort of unlock the hidden complexities of print has been an inspiration in my understanding of the medium as well. John and Susan are scholars whose work on early 19th century France I have regarded with perhaps an unhealthy degree of reverence during my academic training. And so it's a tremendous privilege to be in dialogue with them this evening. What I thought I would do is give a brief overview of what I've tried to do in the book, but before that, take a few minutes to comment on a few of the concepts that shaped it, which is a nice kind of conversation you can have outside of the book. Right. Firstly, this book was not meant to be about extraction. It began as a book about time, about how late 18th and early 19th century landscape painting attempted to reconcile divergent ideas about human history on the one hand and natural history on the other. And you can see why Susan and John were scholars that I was returning to quite a lot. So I thought of it as a study of how landscape served as a kind of laboratory for artists to make sense of the deep time of geology, for example, or what Julian Nordblad calls the long-termism of the forest. So this includes ascendant systems of causality, horizons of interest, scalar disjunctions, and even a new concept of the event as a category that were fundamentally non-synchronous with humanistic narrative traditions on which academic art was, of course, founded. This same moment, the early 19th century in particular, is when history itself is being consolidated as a humanistic discipline, and that conjunction really interested me. And I was thinking in particular that our own discipline, art history, must be employing systems of knowledge and forms of analysis which emerged during this period and therefore also were forged under enormous pressure from these natural or scientific forms of historical thought. Extractive processes and logics were present across the context that I was examining, but they were in the background. These are a few of the books that I really enjoyed reading, and a few years in, I encountered particularly the work of some literary scholars, some Victorianists, including Liz Miller and Nathan Hensley, who were interrogating what they characterize as the aesthetic structures, that is, the forms of extraction in 19th century novels and poetry. And this became a really transformative prompt for me to go back to my archive and pose different questions. What were the pictorial forms of extraction? How did pictures enact its logic? And at that point, it was this very background status of extraction that came to transfix me, what I would come to think of as a sort of sub-visibility or smoothness, which I wanted to subject to inquiry. Another productive prompt came from literary scholar Adeline Buckland, in her work on the raw material as a category that emerges, she shows, from 19th century British colonial discourse. Apparently unmediated and unprocessed, Buckland writes, quote-unquote raw materials could be imagined to lie across the earth and within the earth as free gifts to humanity, available to those with the intelligence to recognize their latent economic value. And above all, the term alleges that things in the natural world have no cultural, material, religious, or emotional significance outside of the specific market for which they are intended. and that is to designate something as a raw material is effectively to deny that it has any legitimate value prior to its conversion into a unit of economic exchange, specifically as defined by the colonial powers of the global north. And Buckland's account reminds us that the early 19th century gave rise to a rhetoric of neutrality that was anything but neutral, and that expressed hidden priorities and belief systems. And I took that as an invitation, therefore, to scrutinize the very ubiquity of extraction as a term, and to attempt an initial inventory of the uneven and varied process through which that came to be the case in the first 70 or so years of the Industrial Revolution. Another way that this book became about extraction is that I went to cite a book on extraction in this period, and there wasn't one. So if that happens to you, consider that someone's got to write it, and it might be you. So apprehending the history of extraction requires us to look anew at not only what was being represented in artwork, so for example, portraying the literal subject matter of extractive industries such as timber harvesting, but also how it was being represented. And by this, I mean the compositional work of depicting a physical environment in a manner that allowed the viewer to identify a certain component of it as a raw material available for prospective extraction. In addition, I think we're compelled to ask new questions about the status of the human as an observer of and participant in environments that were undergoing radical reorganization. This is a sticky point for me. Extraction didn't just happen out there. Its effects were experienced intimately. And consequently, so the first half of the book looks a lot at specific industries like timber harvesting and mining. But I also examine interlinked ideas about race, climate, and waste through which the human sort of stakes and consequences of environmental extraction are being kind of enacted. I insist upon a relatively narrow definition of extraction in this moment. I mean, and I should also say it's fundamentally distinct from extractivism. And also distinct from fossil capital. So I take it to denote the historical emergence of a new way of both treating and understanding the natural world that was characterized by large-scale, coordinated, self-accelerating efforts to quantify, to optimize, to separate, to circulate, and to monetize the physical environment across global networks. And importantly, these operations were interlocking. That's something that's specific to how extraction functions at this moment and would endure. So, for example, the large-scale removal and processing of minerals from the earth required an accelerated industrial timber harvesting, drastically transformed a range of neighboring agricultural processes. As a result, it created the need for internal and external transit systems, which would come to be powered by mined coal, and activated through that staggering array of other extractive processes that were distributed across Europe's colonial networks. The 18th century French term exploitation, from which the English exploitation derives, captures some of its features. Exploitation, when I first encountered on the exploitation of woods, I thought, what a sinister title for a book.
Sorry, but could you put the microphone a bit closer?
Oh, sorry, thank you. Okay, is this better? Right. Exploitation, right. So in the 18th century, it meant the removal and processing of materials from a physical environment, mostly in relation to timber harvesting and mining. And its primary meaning could coincide with the word's secondary meaning, which was to make something economically valuable. By the early 18th century, though, negative meanings had accrued to the word as well, perhaps to register a growing awareness of its consequences. So to exploit, according to later French dictionaries, was to illicitly or improperly remove profit from something or someone, to defraud. You could use it to describe someone cheating at cards, for instance. Now, I make no claims to be exhaustive in this book. I only look at France, Britain, and German states, some of their colonial networks. I do not contend with the extraction of non-human animals, and my visual objects are pointedly and deliberately plural. Plenty of them aren't landscapes. While I often reflect on the colonial aspects of European extraction, I do not address the lived perspectives or the visual cultures of colonized communities. I need to be clear about that. Moreover, extractive modernity developed unevenly across Western Europe in the 19th century. Both ore mining and timber management advanced earlier in German states and in Northern Europe than in Britain and France, for example. German and French extractive practices were heavily regulated by a centralized state apparatus, whereas British industries were comparatively dispersed and were regulated by private economic actors until several decades into the 19th century for the most part. Now, although inconvenient for me when I was researching it, I came to believe that these historical asymmetries were productive because they enable us to examine an emergent kind of visual repertoire of extraction while it was in formation, rather than once it had become ubiquitous and naturalized. So to go through how I approach this, a brief overview. First, I look at the French landscape tradition alongside the new science of forest management in territorial France and colonial Algeria. And in this portion of the book, I propose that academic landscape paintings often pictured a world whose elements could be unbundled, that is, conceptually isolated from their context and subsequently quantified, valued, and set into circulation. And I explore how works like Hubert Robert, who's a detail of his painting I'm showing you on the right here, and others gave pictorial form to new technocratic procedures for exploiting various kinds of value in France's forests. Turning next to the mid-century Barbizon school, then, I argue that the so-called ecological turn taken in their paintings did thwart certain extractive modes of looking, but was nevertheless a product of colonial forest management in both practical and conceptual terms. As landscape paintings of colonial Algeria make clear, trees were understood to be a fundamental, perhaps the fundamental instrument that French administrators wielded to control the climate of both territorial France and its colonies, especially in North Africa. So timber extraction, therefore, compels us to think about the 19th century landscape as something that linked and spoke across vast geographical distances, rather than as something that was becoming ever more firmly rooted in specific identifiable places. And that's an example of an approach that I think could be expanded on and used elsewhere, because we have this idea of landscape becoming more and more site-specific in the 19th century, but it might actually be doing something quite different. After that, I'm looking at early 19th century German landscapes and ore mining, and I consider how extractive practices physically and visually displaced the human within the landscape. Accessed through elaborate networks of subterranean shafts, the closed pit mines that were decidedly vertical in their spatial orientation. In this manner, they contravened the horizontal logic of landscape painting and radically limited the viewer's perceptual access to the mineral world. Alongside the mine's spatial displacement of the human observer, the scientific study of geology foregrounded a set of natural processes and events for which human perceptual powers were wholly inadequate. So I propose that mineral extraction installed intractable forms of imperception and incomprehension within the human experience of the natural world in this context, and that we can observe artworks responding to the grave challenges that these concepts pose to the human observer by incorporating forms of blindness and unknowability within the worlds that they pictured. Alongside the mind's spatial displacement of the human observer, the scientific study of geology foregrounded a set. Oh, did I just say that? Yes, I did, sorry. To what extent did landscapes supply a kind of pictorial infrastructure for managing the more dangerous aspects of industrial extraction? The desired inflow of natural resources such as timber, coal, and water to industrial centers coincided with the rapidly escalating outflow of threatening substances like pyrotechnic energy, noxious gases, and sewage. The British painter and amateur engineer John Martin fixated on the perils of the unconstrained circulations set in motion by extraction, including illustrating his own plan, and I'm not showing you this, for a mine ventilation scheme, Butler and Martin were actually sort of enemies on the concept of how to best ventilate a mine, but he's not here to disagree with me about it. In any case, in this portion of the book, I'm looking first to widespread fears about coal mining accidents, and later to the urban infrastructure of water and waste, to reveal how British artists encountered an environment in which a quote-unquote metabolic rift precipitated new crises for the transit of water and waste. And in this, I tried to enumerate a range of pictorial and metapictorial techniques that John Martin developed for responding to this crisis, including an appeal to scale effects. In early and mid-19th century Britain, scale was becoming a significant tool for British imperial governance and was similarly used to conceptualize economic exchanges, energy systems, and other complex, sometimes invisible forms of relationality animating European industrial extraction. In this diagram in particular, Martin's actually included arrows, numbered arrows, which show you the order in which your eye is supposed to move across the different aspects of the composition, as if the viewer's perceptual experience is one of these flows that's in need of management. The final portion of the book discusses how these transformations reframed the human as a natural resource available for prospective extraction. Its focus is on picturing human separability and the burgeoning science of racial difference. In the century preceding the publication of Charles Darwin's work on natural selection, French expeditions in the Pacific Ocean spurred new debates about the extent to which the human as a biological entity had changed over time, and whether climate played a determinative role in its shaping. In this moment, you have two very different accounts that appeared within French comparative anatomy. And one, which was championed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, humans and their environments were understood to have a radically reciprocal relationship. And according to this system, it was conceptually impossible to unbundle any one element from its context. And in the rival account, which was proffered by Georges Cuvier and which would come to dominate, humans were understood to be fundamentally separate and biologically distinct from their environment. And it was this latter notion that humans are separable from their quote-unquote environment, which also enabled what Suman Seth calls the hardening of a biological conception of race, that triumphed. Ironically, this enabled the human body to be treated like any other resource. In the early 19th century, the experience itself came into view as a prospective resource that could be managed and monetized, and its legacy includes, I believe, the attention economy of our 21st century mediascape. Picturing landscape provided a potent visual arena within which the relationship between the human and the natural world was diagrammed, transformed, and tested. It articulated pictorial conditions of possibility for what could be thought and what could be seen. At times, landscape was drafted into the service of new economic imperatives. At other times, landscape's existing formats were revealed to be inadequate to expressing the new realities of an extractive regime. If we take seriously the logic of 19th century extraction, its self-acceleration, its restructuring of human relationality to the natural world, its intolerance of that which cannot be captured by its protocols, and its mediation of human perception, then we are compelled to inventory landscape's participation in its history. It requires rethinking the work that picturing landscape does and holding open the possibility of what picturing landscape might yet do.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a great review of a great book. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be on this panel and to be talking about this remarkable accomplishment, which is Stephanie O'Rourke's book. It's beautiful. The images are incredible. The paper is glossy. I'm wondering what material it's made out of. There are images on nearly every page, and the readings are wonderfully evocative and illuminating. Images, many of which I'd never seen before, many of which I had seen before, and the ones I'd seen before do appear in many new ways. I see things in them, but I also see things that are hidden in them that I hadn't noticed previously. So it's really a remarkable book. And also, as a historian of science, I applaud it for merging art history, history of science, as well as environmental history, and in a way that should be clear from the points that Stephanie just raised, the history of technology as well. This is a history of industrialization through the history of images of landscape and modes of picturing landscape. As Stephanie nicely summarized, the archive under consideration here is extremely varied. There are canonical paintings, there are drawings, industrial drawings, colonial administrative drawings, prints, mezzotints, sketches of many kinds. And the overall ambition here is to show that a new way of seeing emerged across many, if not all, fields in the early 19th century. And this is a way of not only seeing, but technologies and modes of working that produce and picture landscape in a particular way as something to be extracted where there is a latent potential value in every domain of the world. The images that show that value are part of the technical apparatus for extracting it in the way that Stephanie presents it. And I think that's a really remarkable point. There is, of course, there's an earlier history to this mode of seeing, which certainly goes back at least to the 17th century, to the Royal Society, to Louis XIV, who's talked about quite a lot in Colbert's ways of lining up trees, lining up natural resources for the control and extraction of the state. What seems to be distinctive here is that, first of all, the energetic basis has shifted. We're now in an age of coal. Secondly, we are now in a much more explicitly and aggressively global era. So the ways in which what's happening in Europe intersects with and borrows from, as well as ideologically distancing itself from what is happening in the colonies, is central. But above all, it's the way in which these ways of seeing and the technologies that go along with them are understood in an interlocking way, an accelerating way as well. So what's happening with waste, what's happening with water, what's happening with trees, what's happening with humans all go together. And what's crucial is to train people to see and to learn to see and find ways of picturing how they all fit together. And that's, I think, the distinctive aspect of the extractive vision that Stephanie makes clear. And this kind of intercommunicability between many different systems driven by carbon, bridging metropole and periphery. The structure is extremely helpful and lucid. 4 major chapters, each focused on one domain of reality, often with 1 or 2 canonical painters as part of the story, but also often a scientific controversy as the kind of guiding theme. And we've got timber and the Barbizon school in the first chapter, as well as the controversy over deforestation and the impact that it might have on climate as is being debated in the Academy of Sciences in the early 19th century. We've got mining, and we've got Schinkel and Caspar Friedrich, as well as the debate between 2 different schools of geology, including one of which is Hutton's vision of a deep time, an abyss of time, which is actually imperceptible. And yet these methods of seeing make it seen in some way, make it visible in some way. The 3rd chapter is focused on John Martin. And to me, that's the most kind of gratifying chapter because I love John Martin, and there's clearly something in his enormous, sublime, quasi-panoramic images that is connected to the attempt to see everything in a single glance, the engineering vision of others in his period, but I didn't realize that he was actually an engineer mapping urban flows of waste and productivity, so it makes perfect sense. This is extremely illuminating for my understanding of Martin, and I think it's quite nice the way Stephanie suggests, maybe after Michel Serres, we've overemphasized Turner as the theorist of thermodynamics, or as the painter of thermodynamics, and in fact, it's the sublime and historical landscapes and the systematic landscapes, not simply vague, but also systematic, of Martin that we need to really center in the early 19th century. And then the 4th chapter, human resources, looking at human life as a resource, the categories of race emerging, the extractability of humans as part of that story in colonial and in European settings, and there the debates between Lamarck and Cuvier are really central. And the artist in question, there are a few, but Delacroix and Ingres are discussed in some detail. So I think that's a very nice structure to kind of move us through these different zones, as well as a way of getting some grip on the really vast resources, intellectual resources that she draws upon in history of science, history of technology, and history of art. I just have a few points that I really want to underline in the book, and that are maybe questions for the conversation. The first is the epistemology of the visible and the imperceptible. So there's a really lovely interplay between the sense that what we're seeing in these images is the complete exposure of the world, making everything accessible to vision, everything acceptable to an optical understanding. And that's a long-standing way of talking about what's emerging in the 19th century, but there is a very nice contrast with the ways in which certain kinds of perception, certain kinds of picturing, wind up foregrounding what cannot be seen. The depths of the mind, the depths of history in the transmutations that organisms undergo, the extent and complexity of a system, especially a system at the scale of a city or a nation or indeed of the world, as we see in Martin. So I think that's a wonderful point. I'm slightly curious about it. In what sense is that imperceptibility a blockage for perception, and in what ways is there actually an epistemology around what can't be seen? Is there a way in which Friedrich or Martin, for example, are giving us ways of seeing what can't be seen or working around what can't be seen, so that it's not a blockage, but rather a further invitation to extraction? Along this point of what's methods for picturing, there's a very nice reflexivity throughout in the kinds of objects that are there for extraction and the kinds of objects and practices that are used to picture that extraction. So the materials of representation, whether it's wood or canvas or paints, are something that is seen, but also something that is used to represent what's being seen. That reflexivity goes with an interesting paradox, I think, in the epistemology that's being sketched out here. On the one hand, this is very much in line with a view of the 19th century as aiming for total separability between human perception and what is seen, between humans and what is seen. This is the myth of objectivity, or the ideal of objectivity, or of naturalism, or of modernism, of scientific modernism, to be separate from the things one studies. And yet the means through which we make that separation are extremely technical, extremely material, and they aim ultimately, or not even ultimately, from the very beginning, in the ways in which these pictures are produced, they are part of that same system of extraction and technical control. So there's an interesting reflexivity, and I'm not sure if it's a harmful paradox or simply something to illuminate in that. In studying the natural world as extraction, we create a distance, which is actually an illusion, because it aims at overcoming that distance or skipping that distance, making use of it and therefore transforming it. We are not natural, we are not nature. In seeing that way, the aim is to mix ourselves with nature, to transform nature. The search for depth, of hidden depths in the 19th century made me think of The Order of Things of Michel Foucault, a book which is much debated or much forgotten, often corrected. And I do wonder to what extent we are still in the space of Foucault, or is there a new turn here? Just the way in which life, labor, and language are these quasi-empiricities that the sciences of linguistics and biology and economics emerge to reckon with, to control. Is this ultimately a kind of discipline and punish of the whole natural world, with humans as part of the story? Where do we stand in relation to Foucault now, I don't know, 60 years on? Okay, the next point I want to make is a kind of question too. When we talk about extraction, there is a tendency to follow the example of extraction, or the extractive gaze, and see everything as equally the same, equally open to that kind of in framing, or to see it equally as a kind of standing reserve. It does have a kind of addictive compulsion to it. Once you start to look at extraction as a mode, everything looks like extraction. And there is a sense that many things are brought into that perspective. How do we make sense of the fact that many of these artworks, which are given very illuminating and surprising readings in terms of extraction, have been read in other ways, and can probably still be read in other ways, simply in aesthetic terms, simply in terms of pleasure, simply in terms of a contemplative gaze? Does this view allow for, does the theory developed here by Stephanie, allow for other voicings of these same images, other modes in which they can be encountered? Does it allow also for other ideologies that could be sutured to them? This is an era of utopian and reformist thought. Some of that does get harnessed to, or is driven by extractive logics. Some of it aims at a more egalitarian way of living together between humans, and also between humans and the rest of the natural world. I'm thinking, for example, among many possible examples, of the anarchist geologists or geographers of the late 19th century, who are using some of these same modes of picturing, but very much with an aim of keeping a kind of balance and a kind of lateral connection between humans and the not-human world. Are other ideologies, can they be merged with, or can they be superimposed upon the same set of modes of picturing that are described here? I think another point, probably my final point, is that to summarize what's going on here, I think it's quite illuminating to think of it, as Stephanie says, as the emergence of a way of seeing infrastructure. That's not a term that's used in the 19th century, as she says, but it's what's being seen. What are the conditions of possibility for the new productive modes of life and interconnected modes of life that are showing up at this time? In what ways can we see the backdrop that makes the visible forms of life and the commodities and the objects and resources that are part of them visible, or makes them possible? And I think that's a really remarkable contribution here. How do we see infrastructure? How do we picture infrastructure? What are the technologies and ways of seeing that backdrop? Along with this is the idea that one of the resources that is being formatted and extracted is our own view, is our own vision, our own attention. And I think in the example of John Martin, that he's guiding the viewer through the painting, that's a clear example. So this is another way in which we are inseparably imbricated in the system that we are studying, as it were, from a different distance. But the perception of infrastructure, that I think is really what this is all about, comes to light in the morning paper today, when we're reading about the escalating war that the US and Israel is making against Iran. Apparently, a natural gas factory was bombed, one in Qatar and one in Iran. This is a massive escalation of the war. Not simply attacking supply lines, not simply attacking commodities, but attacking the possibility of production. And this makes me think, in fact, that part of what Stephanie is describing was already described by von Clausewitz in the same era, in describing, excuse me, in talking about war, in his essay on war. This is a coup d'oeil, right? The view of infrastructure is to see everything in a single glance, which certainly has aspects of production and extraction, but very much also elements of destruction. So it's a tool of total war as much as it's a tool of productivity. And I think that kind of unpleasant echo between what Stephanie is describing, unpleasant but necessary echo between what she's describing in the 19th century and today, is one of the biggest lessons that I take from this fantastic book. So thank you, Stephanie.
I have spent most of my career working on figure painting and drawing, history painting, genre painting, some portraiture. So I was surprised when Stephanie O'Rourke invited me to comment on her book, and as much surprised that I accepted, because Landscape is a genre that I've never warmed to particularly. I find it kind of samey, sometimes even a little, dare I say in this room, boring. Now, I will say that Stephanie's book has changed my view of that, and that is because she situates landscape views as protagonists in a drama of extraction, setting them within these larger political and economic forces and changing scientific conceptions that regarded nature as a set of resources to be appropriated, modified, and then monetized, transformed into commodities. So this is a book that takes on landscape as really the privileged subject of eco-critical art history, a subfield that has blossomed in only the past 15 or so years within our discipline, given its focus on the relationship between art and the environment. As Stephanie puts it, the landscape as an artistic genre has always been sympathetic to extraction insofar as it instrumentalizes the natural world according to a set of use values, be they aesthetic, economic, or otherwise, close quote. It's economic use value that really determines the structure of her book, for she organizes chapters, as you have just heard, according to the resources most intensively developed for extraction in different parts of Europe and its colonies during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, beginning with timber harvesting in France, exemplified visually by Hubert Robert's painting and Duhamel de Monceau's abstracted diagram of a tree trunk, then moving in chapter 2 to ore mining in Germany, exemplified by Caspar David Friedrich's painting and Schinkel's paintings, and by prints of the subterranean architecture of mining. And then chapter 3 on to Britain and the subterranean flows of gas, sewage, and water set in motion by industrial extraction in Britain and threatening to get out of control, exemplified by the work of professional artist and amateur engineer John Martin. And then finally, chapter 4, human beings considered as resources, depending on whether they were conceived as embedded in or separable from their environments, according to competing theories of them as biological entities current at this time, and as exemplified by illustrations of French scientific expeditions to the Pacific, and secondarily by French figure paintings. But if resources and their geologies organize the book, it's really Stephanie's insistence on visual representation and visual perception that drives its discussion, and that marks her contribution as an art historian to this interdisciplinary field of eco-criticism. She highlights the visual dimension by beginning every chapter and some sections by plunging you headlong into visual apprehension of a work of art. And by headlong, I mean this. This is the first sentence of the book. There is the print, and there is also what the print encloses. So if we want to know what she's talking about, we have to look left at the image on the illustration on the facing page, which is this, where we are guided by her words to notice the frames that encircle the page and encircle the inset images, that they imitate wood, and that the irregular, the oddly shaped frame on the right mimics the silhouette of a mining tunnel carved out underground. So this is a print, it's a hand-colored engraving that evokes the world of material substances lying beneath the ground, and which then proceeds to actually enact a journey down below, or as the collection's title calls it, an experience of the interior of the earth by inviting you to lift up the frames and see what lies underneath, which are images of fragments of rock. And we can tell that these are fragments by the shadows they cast and their irregular contours, and then conveniently on the framing, on the exterior frame, there are scales engraved that indicate their physical dimensions. So these are examples of natural resources. That is a term like raw materials that Stephanie and her colleagues in this field problematize. Natural resources brought out of the ground before being subjected to several stages of processing to remove the ore from the rock. So this two-layered print visually performs the extraction of mineral ore as a useful resource, and potentially also a beautiful one, as represented in this intermediary stage. Now, kickstarting discussion with visual analysis of this kind is a very effective narrative strategy, as some of you who are writing papers and dissertations may learn, because it anchors works of art as reference points in a dense and quite intricate web of scientific, historical, and national histories that weave in and around them. In other words, she brings off a balance between analysis of works of art and discussion of their contexts, and that is a difficult thing to achieve. One of the things that I really liked most about picturing landscape in an age of extraction is the author's declaration that, quote, "This book analyzes the work that landscapes do," italicized work and do. In other words, she accords agency to works of art as not only shaped by, but shapers of the extractive view of nature. You've just heard about one example of that, and perhaps notice that her analysis has two dimensions. She begins with one's visual apprehension of a work before developing her visual analysis of that work. That is, she's concerned first with how you take something in, and then with the messages that its form and content convey. There are a few other observations I would make about her approach to the work that landscapes do, which is for me one of the really crucial concepts in this book. She sets out firstly to set out certain ideas of or conceptions of nature that pictures of landscape positively deliver. One example is the appraising look fostered by a great deal of landscape painting from this period, so that in Hubert Robert's painting of trees being cut down at Versailles, we're encouraged to count the trees, to notice the differences between them, to pay attention to their state of remove from nature. In Caspar David Friedrich's painting of evening, presented for our admiration is really the regularity and uniformity of this stretch of German forest as well-managed woodland, primed for economic exploitation. This appraising look, she argues, was in league with the quantifying protocols of timber extraction. Now, secondly, and as John emphasized, this is a book as concerned with visual perception as it is with visual representation, and she is keen to point out aspects of a subject that we do not see or that challenge visual representation. These include the subterranean activities of mining and substances swirling around underground that preoccupied John Martin. She effects, I think, quite a wonderful transition between chapters 1 and 2 from the horizontal format that is so familiar to us for most landscape painting to the unfamiliar vertical orientation demanded by the visual representation of ore mining and stratigraphic depiction of mineral deposits. Another invisible subject was the deep time of pre-human history posited by geological exploration, as John again alluded to, which was so far outside the known measures and even metaphorical images for representing time that it was almost impossible to fathom, let alone to picture. The closest visual representation of deep time we get in this period is something like this projected abstraction of a cross-section of the Earth. And then thirdly, Stephanie also mentions the limits of landscape as a genre per se. She asks, is landscape too complicitous in the mindset of extraction to be able to represent it critically? That, I think, is a very interesting question. It's asked quietly in the conclusion of the book, and perhaps we can come back to that in the Q&A. The other concept that I would emphasize besides the work that landscapes do is the idea of interdependencies. Again, I think John has alluded to that, as has Stephanie. This is brought out as a thematic, primarily with respect to the geography of France and its colonies. A Barbizon landscape by Théodore Rousseau finds its counterpart in an Algerian landscape by Horace Vernet. These paintings and their subjects would not exist without the other, she argues. The Barbizon artist's celebration of an untouched European forest depended on a lack of aesthetic value being assigned to Algerian forests, which were perceived as decimated by ignorance of how to manage them, that is, how to manage them for capitalist extraction. She brings these two paintings into the same frame, dissolving the stylistic categories that usually separate them in histories of art. Her framework is instead economic, a kind of ideology of trees, regarded as resources to be harvested as seen from a European perspective by European artists. So all in all, Stephanie's emphasis on the interdependencies or interconnections in landscape representation, the geographic spread of her study over France, Germany, Britain, and the Pacific Islands. She said it's not exhaustive, but it's quite impressive to have that spread. And her equalizing treatment of different artistic media, from the high art genre of painting to prints, drawings, different kinds of diagrams. In each chapter, that's quite carefully balanced. All of these mount a persuasive argument for new modes of visual representation of landscape that were adequate to and participated in this pervasiveness of capitalist extraction as a force that was reshaping the interdependence between human beings and nature. Thank you.
I was going to say, I hope you guys don't make me sit in the middle. And yet here we are.
We're going to have about 10 minutes of discussion among our speakers now, and then please save your questions for about the same audience Q&A time. I hope that makes sense.
Right, so am I managing this? I suppose. Well, firstly, enormous thanks to Susan and to John for your kind words and your generosity of thought. There were a few instances where I caught you describing things as if they had been very deliberately achieved, and I'm pleased that that was the effect. I don't think I always knew it at the time. Neither of you is really a historian of landscape. I don't think of myself as a historian of landscape either, and I agree with Susan that landscape's like, it can be a bit dull, can't it? and yet here we are. Although I think of both of you as very invested in, I suppose, the mechanisms of historical thought that emerge in early 19th century France, and also in different ways about the forms of knowledge and understanding that certain pictorial formats make possible. So I suppose to that end, I might begin, well, maybe I'll begin with a question for each of you, which is, first, and you could answer this either way, I suppose. Is there a format or a genre or an example that you work on that you think can kind of fit within an extractive paradigm that you work on differently? And or do you have in mind, or could you call to mind, at risk of putting you on the spot, something that runs against the grain of that?
Sure. I don't know if I can go against the grain, but a kind of follow-up question I had for you was the interlocking nature of the different kinds of resource and the relation between a site and the transport, the processing of whatever it is. That's massive, and that's great. And the interlocking relationship between the colony and Europe is striking throughout. What I didn't hear as much about is the interlocking timescales of those settings and those processes. It's interesting that you started by asking, that you wanted to be asking about historical, human, and natural temporalities and the way they emerged uncomfortably in landscape. So my example was going to be a kind of, I don't know if it's a counterexample, but it's one which is all about temporalities and interlocking temporalities, which is Auguste Comte and his Church of Positivism and his system of positivism, which is a series of different sciences, all the sciences for all natural things. He's running this period. He's trained as an engineer. And from astronomy to the earth to chemistry to biology to humans, each one of those sciences has its own concepts, has its own processes, and has its own temporality. And so the overall philosophical, which becomes a political and social and even religious system, is all about coordinating those temporalities. So it's the engineering interlocking perception, merging domains of existence, but also doing so along temporal lines. So that's just another dimension, I think, which you started with. And I'm curious about where you see it in where you got to. In what ways are extractive modes of picturing the coordination of different kinds of temporality as well? I don't know, Susan, do you want to share one of your examples?
Well, I feel like Stephanie's question is an invitation to talk about figure painting. Because you told me that. And so I snuck in a few other slides here. These come into her chapter.
The last one, yeah, 4.
Is it 4? Yeah. Okay, at any rate, and I didn't discuss them because I took the subject of the book to be landscape, as its title indicates, and I would say that Stephanie offered, I think, the best reading that I have ever encountered of Delacroix's ruins, Greece on the Ruins of Missolonghi, in talking about really talking about color, which is a key device for discussing Delacroix, and bringing in these paintings in order to bring the discussion of racism, of racial hierarchies into a European domain, rather than always positing it out there in the islands remotely away from Europe. So here she talks about the whiteness of the chest, the breast of Greece as really a central kind of pulsating motif, and then goes on to to talk about the way color is treated in the figure so that it begins blending and dissolving into its rocky landscape background. This becomes a kind of allegory for Greece, the seminal civilization of Westernizing Europe, losing its identity and purity after 400 years of Ottoman rule, which is what the war in question was about. And she then goes on, actually fabulously, I thought, to talk about how the painting itself works on you as a viewer, as a work that was exhibited in a special exhibition raising money for victims of the Greek cause, and as a figure that addresses you as a member going into that exhibition, paying money to participate in the politics that were going on, and then being sort of forcibly addressed by the figure in the painting. So it's a very wonderful example of work that a painting is doing, not a landscape painting, but a figure painting. And she then references that to the Einkra as a painting that separates. So this is a painting that would correspond a little bit more to the Lamarckian view of humans as embedded in their environment. And Einkra would relate to the nasty, dominant Cuvier view of humans as separable from their environment, as in relation to these three very distinct races and their separations that are portrayed in the painting. And I thought that was plausible, and also that color, which is something I've worked on, but you probably have not yet looked at that research. Einger's notion of color has everything to do with separation. He understood it as local color, as actually inherent in an object that was being portrayed, rather than as having any interconnection with its environment or things next to it, which was Delacroix's notion of color. So your discussion of color in relation to the Delacroix could be wonderfully extended in relation to the Einkra. And that I guess would be my answer to how I would not have expected to see extraction working as a vision in relation to figure paintings like these.
Yeah, thank you both for those comments. I had to say, Susan, after you agreed to comment on my book, I had a brief panic because my understanding of Ingres is, comes from your scholarship, and this was where I feel the most extended in the book.
Yeah.
It's it's a bit of a push, and actually a dear friend and colleague, as I was tearing my hair out trying to figure out how the pieces fit together, suggested I just cut the chapter, which, by the way, is not a very supportive thing to say to a colleague. Why don't you just delete it? So it's with a sense of relief that you think it works. And I suppose I'll mention, so firstly, something that we haven't discussed really is ecology, although I have somewhat set myself against the grain of a certain a way of thinking about ecological art history in this. And I'm also interested in some counterintuitive readings there, because this is also sort of a false dichotomy. I mean, the whole concept of ecology as a historical form of thought is in some ways a product of the logic and science of extraction. And I'm also interested in artworks that are not heroic actors. That's, this question of landscape's complicity, and maybe this is something that the two of you could weigh in on before we open up for audience question, was whether you can, our artworks are so often our heroic actors or objects, and And we like to think of artworks working against the grain of problematic political structures. They're socially subversive. They are articulating radical truths that are unspeakable in other formats. And, and they can do that, and they do that. But they also conserve the status quo. And it's very uncomfortable, I think, to force yourself to not just work on, but try to get very invested in pictures that affirm a system that is ultimately very destructive. So that can feel quite uncomfortable. I mean, some of the images that I deal with in the fourth chapter are also, racist. Yeah, and to kind of dwell on those is difficult. So I will say, in the question of landscapes complicity, what I found impossible, which is a task that I thought I was supposed to do, was to identify like an archive of resistance to extraction that we had not fully appreciated. And maybe I was just tired and cynical, but I didn't really find it. And in fact I found I was really dissatisfied with, and I love Greg Thomas's work on the Barbizon School, but it's not enough to say, well, that these paintings show the interconnectedness of natural elements, and therefore they bespeak an ecological view of the world that is ideologically opposed to kind of capitalism and extraction and all kinds of other nasty things. So I did not locate an archive of resistance, and I decided that has to be okay, which is, by the way, not what I did in my first book. All of my artworks were correct and subversive. But so perhaps before we open up, I might ask whether either of you has any thoughts about whether landscapes or pictures in general or historical objects that you work with are too complicit. Can there be artworks that really stand outside of the historical flow?
I'm not going to answer that question. It's too big. I just want to say that the point you're making is one that I really wanted to bring out too. The critique of entanglement is kind of, if you show that things are entangled, somehow you're subverting extraction, somehow you're subverting objectivity and capitalism. Capitalism and objectivity are all about entanglement. So it's a matter of figuring out modes of entanglement. And so I think your critique of a certain way of thinking about the ecological is really very important. One additional thought against the grain. In the Delacroix, I thought that was a moment where he looks incredibly like Anglo, right? Because it's whiteness, but it's marble too, and it's so that's what's being preserved, but around the edges, true, it's blending in. But unusually, he seems to be, giving this kind of human body that looks like it's carved in stone because it's Greece.
And more academic figure, yeah. This is a work that appears in Stephanie's conclusion, Meunier's The Black Country. And I just threw it because I think this is sort of everything John Martin was afraid, was going to happen. And the sort of nastiness of industrial extraction takes up the whole canvas. So it's a painting that seems to me to come close to critique. At the same time, it's clear that this artist was fascinated with this industrializing landscape. So there is this kind of yin-yang in, I think, even in Meunier, and I wondered if maybe other people had reactions to that or to this general point. Maybe we could open it up now to the floor.
Please, after this fantastic exposition of the book and just so many tantalizing avenues of thought here, I invite questions from the floor, and don't be shy. Now's your moment to ask. We've got one straight away from Alex.
I should have responded to quickly, but Meunier showed up about who I've been writing for the past few weeks.
Is that on?
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. the undertaking. That's a good point. Just as a footnote to that, in the 1880s and 90s, many artists made pilgrimages to the Borealis in order to witness this at first hand. And one that I found most disgusting was Siegfried, who just went on about how wonderful it was, all these lovely colours and all these explosions. And he was there in the middle of a steel smelting factory, which had very other things going on with it. But this brings me to a question that was sort of slightly lingering, because certainly you're dealing very fascinatingly with the early 19th century. And you've raised an amazing range of issues. Maybe let's come to an end of it. But I think there is something, there's sort of two slightly related issues. There is a huge difference of the whole politics and cultural grasp of this whole business of extraction and its effects, partly because of the scale in which it was happening, and partly because some of it was coming home. One might see Black Country as the effects, the nasty effects of exploitation and extraction coming home, whereas the Spanish king did not see the poor Mexicans slaving away in the gold mines. And I suppose that brings me to one final point. John, you made a fascinating point about temporality and about the different temporalities that brought into coordination with one another. But the whole business about extraction is that it involves systematic coordination of different temporalities. The temporality at which somebody cuts cotton in the southern states is dictated by the speed at which factories are operating in Manchester. And that is, that's something you don't make visible in the standard painting. And I suppose then the question is, how can it be implied? How can that massive invisible somehow come through?
Well, thank you, Alex, for those comments. I'm not certain I really have an answer to that, but I would say, the issue with this coordination of temporality, as some of you will know, it's with the expansion of the railroads that you have to coordinate time across regions because everyone's going to be on the same time for these timetables to work. So that's an example of a lived system and lived experience falling under a kind of standardized and centrally managed rubric, not necessarily to enable people, but to enable this kind of machinery to function. Yet, I think part of the stickiness of this moment is, and it's something that we're still very much dealing with, there are human and natural temporalities that cannot be fully absorbed into the mechanisms of extraction. So for instance, trees, one of the issues that people contended with, especially in the 18th century, but also in the 17th century, is that the most prized tree would be big, tall, straight. You could use it for ship masts. But to grow a tree like that, it exceeds the kind of horizon of self-interest of any one custodian of the forest. So you need to create a system that forces people to act outside of their own horizon of interest. And that's where the French kind of centralized state apparatus comes in to try to impose some systems from without. And I think a monarchy is especially well placed to conceptualize interest across generations. Another prompt, and I don't talk about this in the book, and this isn't my observation, although I so wish it was, is that Nathan Hensley and Philip Steer talk about coal as effectively archived sunlight, which is what it is, right? You have this organic life that's put in an anaerobic, low oxygen environment over a huge period of time, but this happened before it could naturally decay, and that process of decay is where a lot of the energy that is stored from the sun re-enters natural systems. And in the case of the formation of coal, it doesn't, it gets trapped there. That's why coal is such a dense little bucket of energy. So coal is also it's managing temporal horizons that are, impossible to think with in some ways. But they're also an archive, and archives are how we produce historical knowledge. So, I never found something good to do with coal as archive sunlight, but someone please, that's a little gift if anyone wants to write a paper about it. It's quite a clever observation, I think.
Thank you, Steph. Can you hear me? I'd be very curious about your take on what status for you now does romantic art come to have or remain having. In the 1820s, Hegel says, romantic art is the extraction of human subjective interiority from nature and materials. And what we achieve when we extract ourselves in that form is self-consciousness. We see ourselves. And the canonical example in your presentation this afternoon was that Friedrich wanderer in the mountains. But I take it you would offer a very different reading, which you hinted at this evening, and you hinted at it at more length in your talk in Chicago. But I'd be curious for you just to run through that again, how we would reread that painting in light of your thinking on this whole topic.
The Friedrich, yeah. Thank you, Whitney, for that. As you mentioned, I presented some of the material from this chapter at a conference a few weeks ago, and I really thought someone would take me up on, I say, Friedrich's Wander above a sea of clouds. Don't know if we have it.
I think we all know it.
Yeah, in any case, the painting. The guy is, I've got that.
I think you'd have to switch to.
No, I think it's all one. It's all integrated. In any case, the proposal is that we think he's on top of a mountain, but what if he's at the bottom of a mine shaft, and are they even really so different? And I really thought that someone would take the bait on that. It's yet to happen. Among other things, I'm interested in the fact this is just a very basic observation about this painting, that you can't see the landscape. Right? This is supposedly a painting about the kind of visual mastery of the natural world by this emergent modern bourgeois subject. But the natural world is specifically what he can't see. And he's a figure of blindness in plenty of ways, and that blindness is redoubled by his blockage of our access to the landscape in that device of the Rücken figure, which Friedrich employs across many of his paintings. So I'm interested in this idea that romanticism we take to be about the pursuit of ultimate unity between the human and the world. And this is articulated in German Romantic Naturphilosophie, including some sciences around vitalism. So there is this kind of oneness, and so the study of the self is a study of nature, and the study of nature is a study of the self. Yet, plenty of these figures were very proximate to mining. As I mentioned on Monday, Goethe was a mining administrator, and we have some of the remarks he gave when a silver mine was opened, and he's really all for it. He's like, we are going to get so much silver out of this mine. Like, it's going to be great. So among other things, I think it forces us, it makes us give pause. And what I'm interested in is sort of like flipping that logic of romanticism, or perhaps not taking it at its word, not taking it at face value. That romanticism could be embroiled in and a product of, extractive logics. And equally, coming back to a comment that John made about objectivity, and this, this account of a moment in which the subject and object are being, some form of objectification is taking place. And certainly what interests me here is the extent to which the rendering of the natural world as an object absorbs that logic of the object into the construction of the self, that we make ourselves objects and available to the protocols of extraction at the moment we think we're doing the opposite. And I do think, you know, and this is probably quite proximate to our lived experience in the way that we interface with, like, you know, social media and our devices, and the fact that our attention is monetized, and it's a stream that can be sort of, that we take to be separable in some ways from the kind of whole makeup of a person. You could separate attention, and you could quantify it, you can measure it, you can manage it, and you can monetize it. And that is a premise of, you know, like the economic structure of our online world. So that's how intimately we have made ourselves into objects, I think. I'm interested in that kind of like mutual reciprocity of objectification, perhaps, that's taking place at that moment. Thank you, Whitney, for that question.
Well, thank you for your talk. I thought it was really interesting, and I might wind up using your book in my dissertation, which is really exciting. And I'm very curious about the politics of landscape. I know the book covers Britain, France, and Germany, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the landscapes that come out of each country and whether or not they are different, notably, like while looking at like how extraction is sort of pictured, or if capitalism is sort of like a common denominator through it all.
Thank you. That's, well, good luck with your dissertation. That's a really interesting question, and I think there's an issue here around landscape as an artistic genre, because you don't have uniform kind of trajectories. There are some kind of meta-narratives that we can pull out, like landscape becomes more personal, it becomes more precise, it becomes more kind of affective. It's no longer this sort of static vehicle, in the case of the classical tradition, for certain academic ideals, although something quite different is happening in the northern tradition. So there isn't a very cohesive narrative arc for what comes out, I would say. And I don't think I have an account of really even a national trajectory of the landscape tradition in any of those contexts. And what I would just offer there, especially as someone who's in the process of researching, is that you know, your archive can be lumpy, and you can work with that, and you can accept it instead of trying to make it something that it's not. Extraction doesn't, and this also comes back to John's prompt about how these accounts fit alongside, you know, aesthetics or other narratives. Can images do and mean things other than extraction? And I think the answer is of course they can. And I'm really wary of these totalizing uses of extraction. And it's such a ubiquitous concept, you know, and people will say like, well, I extracted this paper from a larger book chapter or something like that. You know, it's everywhere, but in that way it can also mean sort of nothing. So, it's funny, I've just completely lost my train of thought. Oh yes, aesthetics. So how can a reading of extraction exist alongside, for instance, an account that we have of the British landscape tradition, absorbing the picturesque, but then coming into contact with, you know, mid-19th century kind of social mandates that pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, etc., is absorbing. And I think they're going to sort of pursue their own itineraries. And the interest I have, and this is just a bugbear of mine, because a question that I've gotten a lot historically over this, and some things I worked on for my first book is like, well, what about the sublime? I mean, the sublime just, you know, it's the sublime answers it. And that's another example of a completely flattening concept, like extraction, where you can just like, yes, the sublime is clearly at play in the Friedrich. But it's not the only thing, and so we have to allow aesthetic accounts to exist alongside these other ones, and there'll be intention, and that tension can be productive.
I would just add from what you said. I think this point about the reciprocity of objectifications, or the kind of intimacy of our perception of extraction in the system of extraction, is kind of key, and it's why it's not one or the other. We're already in it. And so there's a kind of ethics and politics to what we do with that. There's no option of being outside of it. And I think that's why it's particularly useful for now, given how much we're obviously inside of digital media. they were already theorizing what it is to be inside of an extractive regime. And there may be many things you can do with that, not only extract, but you have to start from that perspective. There's no way out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you show that really nicely in the 19th century.
One more?
Steve.
Okay, we'll have this question and then our final question will come from Steve.
Yes, thank you for that. Can you all hear me? Walking here from King's Cross tonight reminded me how wonderfully you're situated for imbibing the 19th century, because you've got a canal, two wonderful railway stations, and limitless 19th century buildings. The point I'd like to make is, since I'm a great fan of Kate Retford and her book on conversation pieces, surely so many of these paintings that we just dismiss as landscape paintings, for the people who commissioned them and the people who painted them, they were very much, it's hard to say what, of course each story is different, but somebody like Rodney is not just painting somebody's back garden, he's painting possibly something that never got built, but people were hoping to build. There's all sorts of wonderful puzzles in this. But these pictures are so important, they tell us so much, and I'm surprised to find them being rather depreciated, if you don't know what I'm saying so.
It's just
Well, if I misunderstood you, which I probably have, then my apologies, but it's something I feel very strongly about.
I will. What I will comment there is on the alleged neutrality of landscapes. Often, I think that can be very productively worked against. There's some kind of matter-of-factness. It's like this rocky crag, and okay, so maybe there were some lines of poetry associated with it, or there is this allegation of, I suppose, just to repeat myself, neutrality and matter-of-factness that can enable us to overlook landscapes, and that you have to push yourself sometimes to get past. Is there a final question from Steve?
Our final question.
Thanks. I've got a lot of things to say and to ask, but I'll keep much of that till tomorrow. I was really taken by the picture of the Borinage as somebody who grew up in the English Black Country. I was looking at my childhood, so that was kind of particularly interesting. But I mean, one of the things I think that one might think about in relationship to how one might see a kind of alternative or an alternative vision is to think about the relationship. So much work that's been done around enclosure and the relation of enclosure to ecocide, to the transformation of the landscape, to the transformation of timber and so forth. But Esther and I recently did an event together on Gainsborough. And one of the things that really emerged for me looking at those works is how everything that Barrell and Solkin and people have told us about those works is wrong. They're not landscapes of enclosure, they're landscapes of commoning. And what you find of commoning, the opposite of it, in the contemporary historiography, there's a strong contrast between the commons and enclosure. And what you find in the Gainsborough is they're all in common land, they're all depicting commoners gathering pannage, fallen timber, and so it may be that, strangely enough, it's precisely in the more conservative aspects of the landscape tradition, Gainsborough, Constable, or whatever, that you find an alternative vision to extractivism. And that's an interesting paradox, I think, for us politically, in some ways, precisely because that conservative tradition was so anti-Whig and so anti-industrialisation and so anti-progress that those things start to add up. but it might be that if one starts looking at those conservative visions of the land and landscape, you get a very different kind of vision that's not about either enclosure or extraction. So that's just a quick reflection about thinking about where there is another vision, I think. It has all manner of deeply paradoxical and unpleasant dimensions of its own, but it's not what people have represented it as straightforwardly, I think.
Thank you for that. I look forward to hearing more about commoning. So I hope we'll have a chance to discuss that tomorrow. But I'll just make two brief comments on this. Firstly, I think that these histories really reorient how we classify artworks as sort of good or bad historical actors. So romantic paintings, or even something like Turner, could be in some ways more complicit in a certain kind of machinery than paintings that we think of as very traditionalist. This is part of it doesn't work with certain art historical accounts, which is a sticky one for peer review, but I agree it's a very exciting possibility. And then I'll just mention anecdotally, I'm pretty sure this is true of the British context. I know it's true in the German states, is that one of the earliest and most powerful advocates for protecting traditional forests that have undergrowth, trees of different kinds, different ages, unregulated forest, as opposed to these timber plantations. Powerful lobby is aristocratic hunters, because it was better for their sport. So there's this interesting way that actually the most elite private landowners, and in that case, people who are quite literally, blocking access to this space, are by some accounts kind of on the good side of that argument. So it's a very productive unsettling of assumptions that we make about good and bad actors.
I'm not sure if I want to end on the note of fox hunting or commoning, but I think commoning may be more appropriate for an invitation to join us for drinks in the research forum now. Please do. Before we do that, though, a resounding round of applause for our wonderful